It seems to me that inside every single one of us, there is a basic human need that is only ever fulfilled when we know that someone else really cares for us. That when we're in trouble or distress, they not only understand our need, but they care for us in that need. And the more and more that we learn about Jesus, the clearer it seems to become to us that he cares deeply for every one of us, whether we know him or not. We learn how Jesus, in both his humanity and his deity, wept at the death of his friend Lazarus and of the deep grief that Martha and Mary were suffering at that time. And in a measure this morning, I think, we're going to join again. As he wept, we also may weep. For those who paid the ultimate price for our freedom. And as we look back on 2 world wars and many others before and since, we also want to say to them and to those that are bereaved and those that are suffering that we do care too. We care very much. We care enough to grieve for them. We care enough to try our very best to live in peace. And we care enough to remember them, which we shall do in a little while. It's always a real blessing to be able to listen to amazing stories like the one Sue read to us this morning. I really love it when the same story is recalled by various different people within the Gospels, and each recollection, each perception is just that little bit different. And it's like a new facet on a diamond as far as I'm concerned. It's just a new way of looking at things. It's the same story, but it's just part of the same beautiful truth. But whether we read it in Matthew, Mark or Luke, the fullness of Jesus' humanity alongside of his deity had probably never been more evident, I don't think, to the disciples than it was on this particular day when he calmed the storm at a word. Sometimes in our own lives, certain experiences, I think, take on a new and a real different sort of dimension, I think, in a way that otherwise we might have missed the fullness of it. That sounds really complicated, I'm sure. But I guess that all of us at some time or another have had experiences that help us to understand other things. So I do hope you don't feel that this is untimely, especially on a Remembrance Day, or thoughtless, because it's not meant to be that at all. And I only bring it to you because this wonderful passage of Scripture was brought to life a little bit more to me on this particular day. Our plan was to travel from Bellagio across Lake Como to the other side to Menaggio, and we were going over there to test out the licorice ice creams, if I remember, to see if they were as good as they were the day before. And as we waited by the ferry, I continued to read the book that I was reading. It was cited as being the best of Hornblower's successors. If you haven't read it, I think you really should. It's called Ramage's Mutiny. And there I am in chapter 19. I'm on the Jocasta, which is a frigate, and it's running westward in the Caribbean under studded sails, under a stiff northeasterly wind, along the coastline, a series of bold cliffs, and so on and so on. I was so engrossed in the story that I hardly noticed the mist rolling down the mountainside and engulfing our holiday hotel on the other side of the water at Cadenabia. It was about the time for the ferry to arrive. It was going from Como up to the other end of the lake, and I rounded up our little group of 4 people, which is what we were on holiday, and we all boarded the boat. And then it began. The lake took on a very strange look. as if someone had drawn a line right across the middle of it. What happened next was quite unforgettable, if not a little bit scary. Suddenly, what had been a stiff breeze now blew into a gale. The lake that had been lapping water just a few moments before was whipped into a frenzy of white horses blowing off the top of the waves. And I glanced back as if to confirm, looking back at my book, at what was already happening. Perhaps this was the cauldron, the calderita. And our ferry, it pitched and it rolled, and Rob, one of our travelling companions, thought it an opportune moment to remind me that he couldn't swim, as if I should have known that I could do anything about it. I'm not sure why his concerns were even directed towards me, because, as I say, there's really precious little that I could do. It just seemed that his faith, and probably others too, in the ferry to get us to the other side was now in some considerable doubt. Well, just the fact that I'm standing here this morning is a witness to the fact that we did make it over to Menagio okay, and the ice cream was brilliant. I suspect the skipper and the crew probably weren't quite as concerned as we were. But believe me, there were those on that boat that day who were very afraid. God's word tells us that the storm over the Lake of Galilee was a great storm, where the waves broke over the boat and nearly swamped it. I don't know whether you've ever seen that wonderful Rembrandt painting of the storm over the lake, but it certainly does look like a great storm in his picture, doesn't it? Jesus, in his humanity, was so exhausted after teaching the people that he decided to take the apostles by boat to the opposite side of the shore where there were no large towns, so that he could rest a while. You might say he'd been sort of crowded out a bit. And so in his tiredness, very soon after they set sail, he falls into a deep sleep, where even the battering of the storm didn't wake him. And it's these little truths, I feel, that help us to understand that Jesus was genuinely human. He had the same basic needs that you and I do. It is, after all, Christ's humanity, isn't it, that actually qualifies him to become the intercessor between God and ourselves. And quite soon, that part of the lake, which they hoped would always be on the outside of the boat, is now on the inside of the boat. And panic has set in. And when woken by the cry, "Don't you care if we drown?" Jesus did indeed rebuke the apostles for their lack of faith, though I suspect very much that by extension any one of us might be included in that number. A lapse of faith in time of crisis. And to tell the truth, I suspect we all share that same affliction, don't we? To maintain that 100% faith-filled life at all times is a claim I think that very few of us would dare to make. Of course, Jesus knew that the storm was brewing, and yet even knowing that, he decided to launch out into the sea. And when it became necessary, he calmed the sea at a word. And that, of course, my friends, is now Jesus' deity at work, where even the winds and the waves obey him. The truth is that when everything in our own lives is going well, it may not seem to matter so much if God appears to be asleep. We're in control of our lives, and we can cope with whatever comes along, can't we? If we're honest, sometimes it's almost as if we prefer it if God appears to be snoozing, so that we can just get on with our lives. as we would like to. It all seems so calm, all so very much in control, doesn't it? And then it strikes right out of the blue when we're least expecting it. The storms of life. Maybe it's financial, I don't know. Maybe it's redundancy. Maybe it's an investment crash. Maybe that affects some people. Maybe it's an emotional storm. The breakup of a relationship, perhaps. A row with a friend or family. A war of words. Maybe the loss of a loved one. Or maybe it's a health issue. You're just at your wit's end and you're worried. Or you may be in the middle of a spiritual storm, looking for meaning and for purpose. Maybe you're having a crisis of faith even this morning. I don't know. But be sure the storms do come, and they do come to everyone in one form or another. And then we do want God in our lives, don't we? We want him to be around when we've come to the end of ourselves, when we're at our wit's end. Then we call out, as the disciples did, in our fear and sometimes in our anger too. Don't you care, Lord? Don't you care? Do we sometimes feel a little bit annoyed when it looks like God is sleeping and not answering our prayers and ignoring the situation that has apparently swamped our lives and maybe even threatens to drown you? So what do we learn from the story? Well, we know that the men in this boat were experienced fishermen. They knew the lake. They wouldn't have gone out if they thought they were in any real danger. But despite all their skill and all their experience, it came. The storm came. And how often do we put our experiences and life's lessons into a place where perhaps God should be? We begin to rely on our own intelligence, on our own wisdom, on our own insight even. And most of the time, we do fine. But you already know, don't you, that just as you think you've got it all wrapped up, everything sorted out, and then we're caught out by our complacency and surprised sometimes in our own self-satisfaction. Remember that the disciples thought they were going to drown. I think Rob did too, bless him, on that day. So what did the disciples say? Matthew records, "Lord, save us." And Luke records it as, "Master, Master, we're going to drown." But in Mark's gospel, it reads differently. Not "help save me," but "don't you care? Don't you care if we drown?" And it almost seems just at that moment, they're not even asking to be saved from death, although I very much suspect they would like to. But at that moment of crisis, they were just asking whether or not he cares for them. So whatever, my friends, if you think your situation is a bit hopeless, perhaps, I don't know. If you can't see your way through your storm, the storm in your life, if you feel a bit overwhelmed sometimes and a bit war-torn, or if maybe you just feel that you're the worst of all people, the worst of all sinners, that nobody loves you and nobody cares for you, just be assured this morning that God does love you. He does care for you. And just know for certain, my friends, that if you call on Jesus as the disciples did on that day, he will respond to you. Jesus didn't say to the disciples, "Let's go out on the lake, let's get caught in a storm and drown." He didn't say that at all. He said, "Let's go over to the other side." So is this miracle, is it just a test of faith? Well, maybe it is. I don't know. but I do believe it was part of God's wonderful plan in teaching the disciples to trust him more and more. I don't even know if the disciples expected Jesus to save them, but they did call on him to be reassured that he did care for them. And of course, what they did discover was that Jesus did indeed care for them very much, as he cares for you. And also in a very practical way, of course, he stilled the storm and he saved them. And yet, even in that miraculous power that Jesus showed them, it seemed that in itself made them even more afraid than they were of the storm. Maybe they hadn't quite understood yet, and maybe we haven't either, who Jesus really was. And so they asked one another, didn't they? Who is this? Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? And then, if you'll forgive the pun, they were just blown away, I think, by his power. So in the midst of the crisis that you may be facing this morning, you may not. You may be in the still, calm place. But if you are facing it today or sometime in the future, we just encourage you, my friends, to call on Jesus. Whatever the situation, whatever the time, just call on him. And sometimes, as the apostles did, we almost forget that Jesus is with us. And I believe they'd sort of forgotten as well that Jesus wouldn't always take them out of the situation, but he would take them safely through it to the other side. You see, there aren't times when Jesus is with you and times when he's not. Jesus is always with you. You may choose to forget. You may want to forget that he's with you. But the wonderful truth is, my friends, that Jesus is with you every day, in every situation of your life. He's in your work. He's in your leisure. He's in your relationships. You could say that he's in the same boat as you. And finally, as so often happens, we go back to the beginning. And we see that it was Jesus who suggested that they should go over to the other side. And as the storm blew up and the waves began to swell, do you wonder if they began to blame Jesus for getting them into the situation they were in the mess that they were in? Maybe even that's a situation and an issue for you. I don't know. You're a Christian. You felt God's called you into a work for him, but it's not going well. There seems to be no blessing in it. You feel that God has led you into that relationship, if you like, a work for him, but now it seems to be falling apart. There's a storm crashing all the way around you, but God sometimes just seems to be asleep. You see, the apostles wouldn't have been in the boat unless Jesus had suggested it, something that he wanted to do. It seems they had found the faith to start out, but they didn't have the faith to believe that he would finish what he had started. I just want to assure you that if God has called you to do something for him, he will see it through. Make no mistake about it. He may seem to be sleeping, just as Jesus was sleeping on that day, but he is still in the boat. And of course, when we read the story to its conclusion, we see that Jesus, of course, did get them through to the other side. I know that it seems really hard at times, but you will arrive safely. You will accomplish what God has set out for you to do. It may be a bit of a test of faith. And on this special Remembrance Day, we remember those for whom war was the biggest and most terrifying storm that they ever faced. When millions of people literally came face to face with death, and so many succumbed to it or faced the result of it. God never promised peace in every storm, but he has promised to give us peace through the storm if we trust him to take care of us. Just be encouraged. We're told, that God calms the storm when the time is right and brings us safely to a haven of rest. And he invites you today into this agreement with him. Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you, and you shall glorify me. So as we close then, I don't know whether you've ever heard this song, Sometimes He Calms the Storm. It's a lovely, lovely song written by Benton Stokes and Tony Wood, and it communicates in a couple of lines a beautiful truth. Let me read it to you. Sometimes he calms the storm with a whispered, peace, be still. He can settle any sea, but it doesn't mean he will. Sometimes he holds us close and lets the wind and the waves go wild. Sometimes he calms the storm, and at other times he calms the child.